I am just a Gen Zer. Born in 1995, I am considered on the cusp between Generation Z and the millennial. And I'm sure you're latching on to the fact that I'm a Gen Zer more than anything. We're a big discussion point in the media, in your workplaces, with other generations, and I'm sure with many a career advisor. And whilst most generations get a little bit of attention while they enter the workforce, it does seem as though we're the most controversial generation to date. In the headlines, we're vindicated for our lack of adaptation to the current structures of the workforce. And while some of us have been in the workforce for many years now, we're still talking about it, as though we seemingly can't quite grapple with what my generation need and want. Take a look at these headlines from just the last few months, when some of us have been in the workforce for over 7 years now. The narrative is still carved, Generation Z versus the employer. Now, in my line of work, I speak to many organizations about their workforce and their employees. And it does seem as though we're just kind of waiting for this generation to get used to the way that the workforce works today. But given Gen Z are due to be a third of the workforce by 2030, now is the time to start considering not if they won't change, but they might just not be able to. Instead, what if we could grab hold of the opportunity they pose? We believe that Gen Z might just be able to combat some of our organization's most pressing challenges. Imagine if we could reverse the narrative and instead grab hold of the opportunity they pose, from being the most controversial generation to the one that actually might be the most integral to our workplace's future. Now, before we dive in, it is worth us talking about how we tick and how the rhetoric of change, the workplace needs you to, is quite a pointless argument. When we think about the way that Gen Z grew up, it would be far too simplistic to say that we grew up with technology at our fingertips. This is the way Gen Z grew up. Let's take an example of a Gen Zer born in the year 2000. This Gen Zer grew up in the aftermath of the attack on the World Trade Center in New York City, high-profile wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by the Great Recession, to then study and enter the workforce during a global pandemic. As a result, their ability to trust authority and the institutions that are there to govern society could be pretty challenging. In a recent McKinsey survey of US Gen Zers, they note that they have the highest prevalence of mental health issues and the least positive outlook on the future than any other generation. And so, their commitment to change and impact might not stem from them being idealistic or out of touch with reality, but instead from what they were exposed to in their early childhood. They may intrinsically believe that they need to try and better the world. Their ability to speak truth to power may not stem from them not knowing their place, but instead, they're so used to finding out answers by themselves. This is a generation that had to study and enter the workforce, mostly alone. And thanks to fake news and misinformation, trust in authorities can sometimes be a bit tricky. And so this might go some way to explaining how we tick, but it doesn't necessarily give you the winning argument for why organizations should adapt to accommodate us. Let me tell you how. Now, you might already be thinking, my organization's doing a pretty good job at adapting to the likes of Gen Z. And you're most likely right, to an extent. Organizations are already putting in place measures to attract the likes of Gen Z. We're already seeing mental health support as the standard, digital detoxes as part of the employee experience package. But this is where I think we're missing a trick. If we focus entirely on the employee offering, we're only touching the surface of what my generation need and want. And whilst it might get us in the door, it's unlikely to make us want to stick around. It's in this institutional layer this outer ring of the above graphic, that opportunities arise for organizations to leverage what we have to offer. And importantly, it's the key to retaining us too. We want to understand more about your organizational values, your culture, what workforce progression will be there for me, what structures you have for your careers, what you're doing with ESG, how you're looking at diversity and inclusion. And it won't just be what you do, we'll be asking how you do it too. So for example, if I were interviewing tomorrow, I might ask the question, what development opportunities will I be exposed to in my first year of working for you? And talking the talk, but not walking the walk, has become significantly more difficult now. Ex-employees are all too happy to post on TikTok company culture exposés, or you'll see current employees able to interact with interviewees and make sure that what you're telling them in that interview holds true. Jigsaw, a Google subsidiary company, notes that that's exactly how my generation fact-check. We read the comments section. And so it's in this institutional ring that Gen Z are looking for you to accommodate what they want. And it's in that space that it's worth doing so. Imagine if organizations could take what Gen Z want in this area to readily combat some of their most pressing challenges. I'm going to talk about two of the most fundamental challenges I hear more often than any others in this space, and talk about Gen Z offering new and slightly more innovative ways to solve for them. Let's take the first one, workforce management. This term is often met with a sense of unease. Predicting who you need and when you need them is an age-old problem. And that's normally because the term is followed by these three words: redundancies, rehiring, and retention. At different points in the year, these three words are most organizations' nemesis. And, unfortunately for you, the way that we currently manage those challenges is made a whole lot worse by my generation. Millennials were once coined the job-hopping generation. Gen Z are beating them. According to a recent research paper by FDM, 2/3 of Gen Z believe the key to growing their career is moving jobs, prioritizing new experiences and skills development over any form of job loyalty. That makes retention a pretty big issue, which is costly already, but even more so when there's a need to rehire. On average, it costs £7,000 to hire one employee in the UK. Now, to put that into context, if you had 100 Gen Z employees in your organization today, and 2/3 of them decide to leave you in the next 18 months, that's already a bill just shy of £500,000. So you're probably wondering, Suzy, how on earth is this an opportunity? Well, let's go back to what we know about. Idea number one, fractional, changeable, movable roles. You now have access to a generation of incredibly tech-savvy employees, keen to work out where they might fit in. Well, why not offer them more than one role? You have access to a generation who are driven by access, not ownership. We're already looking at the fractional economy now, the gig economy. Fractionality is the new frontier. Why not instead offer these employees more than one role? Instead of hiring just for that junior digital marketer, why not also hire for a junior sales associate? 2.5 days a week on each team, and that employee now has access to the variety that they're after. But they also now have two potential routes of development. Hello, retention. Idea number two, internal mobility, or just a neat way of saying moving around a company. According to a recent LinkedIn Workplace Learning report, Gen Z lead all other generations in stating that their key motivations for learning are to develop new skills or gain new experiences. Their eagerness for mobility should be encouraged, not least because it can help you too. An employee with a wider set of skills suddenly has access and is far more readily redeployable to other areas of the business, maybe reducing that need to make that employee redundant. And that same report notes that it can help with retention too. Organizations with strong learning cultures have much higher rates of retention and much healthier management pipelines than organizations with lesser commitments, even more so than offering promotions. Importantly too, employees are more likely to stay with you over 2 years at around 75% if they've had a move-in role, but only 56% without a move-in role. That's almost a 20% difference. Idea number 3, and the final one for workplace management: secondments or sabbaticals. Now, you might have heard of these terms before, but in case you haven't, a sabbatical is a short break from your career to return to your original employer a few months later. And a secondment is a temporary transfer of an employee from one organization to another to return back to that employer a few months later. It's a bit like how football clubs loan out players. Why not partner with your supply chain or with a charity and offer secondments to your employees? Why? Well, it creates that thing called workforce agility. Loan out an employee to an organization or an industry that they genuinely care about. You save money while they're away, and that employee gets to get a new experience that they're looking for. They return to you with fresh perspectives, and you might have just improved your odds of retaining that employee longer term. That leads us nicely into challenge number 2, the skills gap. The competition for skills today has never been so high. According to the Confederation of British Industry, 94% of today's employees do not have the skills that they require for 2030. To put that into perspective, that's 30 million UK workers. And organizations are spending a lot of money plugging this skills gap, mainly with temporary hires or contractors. According to the Open University, on average, it's costing about £4.4 billion for UK organizations to plug this skills gap in this way. So again, what if the answer is already in our own workforce? We already know that Gen Z are driven by learning. What's better yet is that there is an economic case for upskilling your employees too. According to McKinsey, 75% of all upskilling cases make economic sense for the employer. They conclude that upskilling an employee over contracting that skill set in is around 20% cheaper. So you might be wondering, well, how would I go about doing it? Idea number 1, career development that is employee-led. Gen Z like to drive their own learning and development, so why not let them? According to FTM, their preferred methods of learning are personalized, in-person, and hands-on. So, why not let them be in charge of their own learning and development budgets? And this doesn't mean it has to be in-office workshops. This could also be after-work university classes, coding courses of their choosing, or, if you're a management consultant in the room, improvisation classes could be quite useful. And you can map these to skills that you're requiring as an organization internally. But what you're doing is you're empowering a generation to work out how to find those skills themselves. Remember, we're used to working alone. Idea number 2, career development that actually works. Old school e-learning just isn't going to cut it anymore. And secretly, a lot of us despise it. According to the Harvard Business Review, if you do not apply the learning that you've just learned in an e-learning module to your day-to-day work, you'll forget over 70% of it within just 6 days. So it's not cost-effective either. So those ideas that we had for challenge number 1 could come in pretty handy for challenge number 2 as well. Internal mobility, secondments, fractional roles, They all play a brilliant part in upskilling too. Add on further ones, like internal apprenticeships or shadowing colleagues. All of these are widely known to be far more effective, but they're also the preferred methods of learning of Gen Z. I've talked to you a lot today, based on a lot of experience of speaking to some of these organizations in the last year, about workforce challenges that I've heard more often than any others. Research ensued, and a pattern emerged. Gen Z could hold the ticket to changing it. History has shown us that there has only ever been benefit to changing organizations with new workforce changes. When millennials joined the workforce, when women did, organizations adapted because they recognized the opportunity it posed. If it wasn't for those changes, people like my mum, who's sitting in the audience today, wouldn't have been able to open her own very successful pub. Change is good in the workforce. I will challenge you. Take this conversation back to your workforce, to your organizations. Start the conversation about changing the narrative that's prevailing around my generation. Maybe the sooner that you see the opportunities we pose, the sooner you'll be able to unlock the benefits we have. Thank you.